Hello everyone, and today we're going to talk about genetic variation. There are a lot of ways that genetics can be influenced by the surrounding environment of an organism. Now, not directly affected, although a modern field of genetics called epigenetics does talk about that. Rather, genetic variation is about how small changes, mutations, which we've talked about before, can lead to the change in a species over time. And these small changes are variations in an organism's genome. So one of the key concepts of genetic variation is a gene pool. So obviously here we see a swimming pool, but there are other types of pool. A pool can also just mean a collection of items. And so a gene pool is a collection of available alleles that can be found in a population. All the possible different alleles that an organism can have, although it won't have all of them, is the available gene pool of that population. So with this pool of options, different individuals can be created, and these are mixed in the ways that we've discussed when a mother and a father organism, or maybe just one organism reproducing asexually, manages to create a new generation. So members of the same species will mostly have the same gene pool because in a local area, over time, all of the genes will become mixed together and any member of the species can breed with any other. So generally, at least within a local area, every member of the same species will be part of the same gene pool. So we mentioned about producing fertile offspring on the last slide, and that is because only members of the same species breeding can produce reliably fertile offspring. Fertile means that the offspring are able to have children of their own. So it is possible for members of different species to produce children, but typically those children will be infertile or certainly less fertile. So one example of cross-species breeding is a mule. A mule is born when a female horse and a male donkey have children together, and this is one kind of interspecies breeding. There is in fact another name for a male horse breeding with a female donkey. So when we talk about populations in the genetic sense, we are talking about a group of members of the same species who all live in the same area. And the fact they live together means that they can interbreed and share the same gene pool. So here we can see people on a street in India, and they are all part of a local population and they share the gene pool of each other. They all have broadly the same subset of genetic qualities. However, they are of course part of the wider human population of Earth, because although we have various different ethnicities of human, we are all still, of course, the same species. We are all human, and in fact, in the broadest sense, humanity around the world has one giant gene pool. We have local ethnicities because until relatively recently, it was not possible for all of the different people from all of the different countries to interbreed. This shows that when groups are isolated from each other, there will be different populations within a species that may have slightly different gene pools. And we do see this in the animal kingdom as well. And in fact, it's only a short step from here to evolution. Over time, the alleles in the gene pool will mix together in different combinations and new individuals will be created. But on top of that, some of these individuals may have mutations and gain other new traits that offer a survival advantage. So these new survival traits mean that the individuals that have them are selected. but they're not selected in a forced way. They're not chosen by anyone or anything. They are simply selected in a natural way. They are able to survive simply because of the traits that they were born with. They are selected naturally. So this means that variation is, quite literally, the spice of life. In order for populations to change, there must be variations between individuals, and there must be new traits coming up by mutation. So this is genetic variation. Different organisms of the same species have different traits and vary from each other. In a sense, you could call variation the raw material of evolution, which is a little bit weird because variation is not an object, it is not a material like stone or glass or metal, but it is, in a way, the only thing that allows evolution to change species over time. So the next word we're going to talk about is speciation, and you might be able to work out what this word means. It is the creation of new species within a population, or rather by dividing a population into two separate populations. If there is a small change in one population and then this changed set of individuals is somehow isolated, then you may end up with two completely different species. And we can see a simple diagram taking place at the bottom here. If there is a blue fish and there is somehow two different mutations, a red stripe and a green stripe, then after many generations, and if there is some kind of environmental barrier between them, we may end up with two new species, a red fish and a green fish. The environmental barrier must be there because, of course, they are, at least to begin with, part of the same species, and if they were allowed to interbreed, then the two mutations would just get blended into the gene pool of a single species, and eventually it might become a red, green and blue fish. There might be a new species, but there would only be one new species. So this kind of environmental barrier was observed by Darwin on the Galapagos Islands when he saw many species on different islands that were very similar to each other but had different qualities depending on the particular island on which he found them. So evolution is obviously one of the biggest ideas in science in the last 200 years, and one name is very closely associated with it. We just mentioned him, Charles Darwin. But when he discovered his ideas of evolution, he didn't publish them immediately. He waited for 10 years, and there are a number of theories why this might be the case. He even went as far as to tell his wife to publish it after his death in case he never decided to do so. And in this time, there was another young naturalist called Alfred Russel Wallace who independently formed a theory of natural selection, and he in fact brought it to Darwin for his opinion. And Darwin said, this is awkward. But the two became great friends, and Wallace, upon seeing Darwin's previous work, agreed that Darwin had come up with the idea first. But it's important, I think, not to let history forget this other independent discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So, evolution did not begin and end with Darwin. Recognizing natural selection was happening was really just the beginning. Over the years that followed, there were others who had to bring various different mathematical models of population genetics. Here are three of the pioneers of this work: Sewell Wright, J.B.S. Haldane, and Robert Fisher. All of them there looking pretty old. Of course, they weren't born old men. So their work clarified the basic processes of evolution which Darwin had outlined, but at that time, Darwin's time, not every scientist had accepted it. The work of these gentlemen made it a much more respected scientific theory. So the modern ideas of evolution, in summary, are that genes control traits and are passed on in reproduction. And this is something of a Mendelian idea, and as we said, Mendel and Darwin were contemporaries. They lived at the same time, but unfortunately they were never allowed to discuss their ideas and compare them. So when genes are passed on, tiny changes may happen in the new code, and we now know these as mutations. And then speciation, the word we saw before, is the effect of the building up of many, many small changes like this, to a point where we can now no longer say that two organisms are of the same species. So the effect of this is that populations evolve. Individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve over time, and individuals are selected naturally because of those tiny little changes that offer them maybe just a very small survival advantage, but a survival advantage nonetheless. So those traits will become more common in the population. So this idea of tiny changes being passed on can also be called microevolution. So tiny changes are modifications to alleles that are passed on down the generations. And I know I am kind of repeating myself a little bit here, but in time, the total of all the different alleles in a population will change. You will eventually have that survival advantage we talked about being normal in the population, because it gives enough of a survival advantage that over time the offspring of that first mutated individual become the majority. So this is microevolution in action, and then as that one trait, that one microevolution becomes the normal, then there may be others, or before then there may be other small changes that build upon that original survival advantage and make it stronger or support it in different ways. So there is a change in the allele frequencies of a population. Some alleles will become less common, the ones that offer less of a survival advantage probably, and some alleles will become more common. So now what we're going to do is to look at some of the different effects that can affect the path of microevolution: mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift. And as with many things in biology and population genetics, you will see a certain amount of crossover between each of these ideas. So we can start by talking briefly about mutation, which we've looked at before. If there is a copying error in the DNA copying process or various other means, there can be changes to a species' genetic code. The offspring of this mutated process can have new traits in the final organism. Brand new alleles can enter the population. Then we have to turn over to natural selection to decide what happens. Although decide isn't the perfect word, because of course there is no choosing being done. No one and no thing actually chooses individuals. So how exactly does natural selection work? Well, again, we've alluded to it before. A new individual is a new combination of alleles, and this gives a new phenotype. A phenotype might be more or less able to survive in the environment it lives in. If the gene combination makes it more able to survive, if it makes survival easier, then the new species has an advantage. And an animal with a survival advantage is much more likely to produce more animals, more offspring, and their alleles are more likely over time to become the normal for that species. So the selection, the decision, is not done by anything, but it is done by probability. And the thing with probability is it's not guaranteed. So it is entirely possible for the greatest survival advantage in the world to be produced in a species, and then through bad luck, that individual simply dies or is eaten by a predator before it has a chance to procreate and pass on that survival advantage. But evolution has billions of years to work with, and so eventually that advantage or a similar one is likely to come up again. So there are other kinds of selection which are slightly less random. Now sometimes there is some actual selection done by choice, kind of. Some animals show off their better genes in ways that can tell possible mates about this. So for example, male peacocks have a very extravagant tail, and the bigger and brighter this tail is, it's more likely to display to the peahens, "Hey ladies, I can find a lot of food and make good nests, because how else would I be able to keep this wonderful tail in order?" So that's what all of these bright colors in the animal kingdom are actually showing to potential mates. They're showing, I have better genes because look how impressive my feathers are. Only someone who can find a lot of good food and keep themselves safe could possibly have such a beautiful tail as this. So that is the idea of sexual selection. So genetic drift, as we said when we talked about speciation, this can only happen if new alleles are kept separate. So the movement of alleles into different populations, or perhaps with humans, the movement of alleles from one ethnic group into another, is called genetic drift. So there are two main types of genetic drift, the founder effect and evolutionary bottlenecks. So one of the possible outcomes is similar but not identical species like these butterflies here, and also like the various species that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands. So the founder effect, the founder is someone who starts something. So sometimes a small group of individuals is separated from the original population and they start, or found, a new population. So the genotypic ratio of the new alleles reflects the ratio of the founders and not of the original population. So let's show an example of this effect in action. So imagine we have a population of people with different colored hair living together on a floating island. So here they all are, population O, we will call this. However, one day, half the population decide to split off half the island and move away by themselves. So before the split, hair color was roughly equal. We can see that red hair was 23, blue hair was 26, yellow was 30, and black hair was 21% of the total population. However, after the split, we have two different populations, population A and population B. At the time of the split then, the red-haired people in population A is 36% of population A. However, in population B, redheads are only 6% of that population. Blue hair is 28% in population A and only 22% in population B. Still similar to the original percentage, but there is now a difference. Yellow hair has gone down to 24% of the population in population A, but is now up to 39% in population B. And black hair is now only 12% of population A, whereas population B, it is now 33%. And so, as these new populations continue to change, any new changes that are seen will be based on these new population percentages, because of course the individuals from the other population are no longer part of the gene pool. And if there are even fewer members of the new population, the founder effect can be even more drastic. So, if you imagine that just 2 people left the island on their own, maybe a black-haired person and a yellow-haired person, and they go off and start their own new population, well, population C, let's say, would be 50% black, 50% yellow, 0% red, and 0% blue. So evolutionary bottlenecks. Like the founder effect, a bottleneck can change the allele frequency drastically in a population. Unlike the founder effect, it affects the whole population, mostly by killing them. So a bottleneck is a large reduction in the population of an organism. In this reduction, some alleles may be completely eliminated from a population, or almost completely eliminated. So let's go back to one of our floating islands and have a look at the effect of an evolutionary bottleneck. So remember population A on their floating island, here they are, and a terrible disease shortly after the loss of population B comes to strike the population. 100% of all blue-haired people die. 60% of all black-haired people die. 60% of red-haired people die, and only 10% of yellow-haired people die. So, to be clear, as far as we're aware, there is no disease that is known that can affect people based on hair color. But maybe there is some other genetic quality that goes along with hair color in this population that leads to different types of hair color being affected differently by disease. Remember, this is only a sort of simple storybook situation. So after the disease has passed, we have a new population, A prime, and that has a new allele frequency. The percentage of red-haired people hasn't really changed very much, and the same for black-haired people. However, blue-haired people have now been completely eliminated from the gene pool. They have fallen to 0%. And because of some strange immunity to the disease or something, yellow-haired people are now 51% of the remaining population. More than half of all the people surviving now have yellow hair. So the continued change of the population will be affected by this bottleneck. Bottlenecks always occur because of random effects such as this. The founder effect can be random if, say, some individuals are accidentally separated from their population, but it can also be a decision made by some individuals to move out on their own and start a new population to themselves. So a more small-scale version of the founder effect is gene flow, and this is when we talked about, say, the change of ethnic populations over time. There are a number of genetically different populations of a species, like in the human population. Then individuals from part of the population may move over into other populations and introduce new alleles to the gene pool. And of course, this is something we see more and more of as the world becomes more and more connected. Genes from other gene pools in other parts of the world mixing with each other. And so the offspring of 2 individuals from, say, very different nationalities, say an Asian and a European person, will have a blend of alleles from the different gene pools. And this itself can lead to new genetic traits. So let's just round up by talking again about the 3 main points of this PowerPoint. Evolution is the change of a species over long periods of time and many generations. Natural selection is the process in which individuals with a survival advantage are more likely to be selected. That is, they are more likely to have children and pass on their survival advantage to future generations. Genetic variation, the thing that we've been talking about, is the raw material of natural selection and the raw material of evolution, therefore. It is A bit like running many genetic experiments together to see what works best. And what works best is what gives that survival advantage.